Good afternoon. My name is Brenda, and I will be your conference operator today. At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the webinar for PJ's Assessing CHDO Development Capacity conference call. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode. Later, we will conduct an interactive question-and-answer session. If you would like to ask a question during that time, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. You will hear a tone acknowledging your request and a prompt to record your name. If you would like to withdraw your question, please press star, then the number 2. I would now like to turn the call over to your host, Mr. Steve Latham, Training and Development Associate. Sir, you may begin.
Thank you very much, Brenda, and welcome today to everybody. As you know, this is a webinar for PJs about assessing CHDO development capacity. This is part of a series on the Consolidated and Further Continuing Appropriations Act of 2012. Fortunately for most of us, we don't have to deal with that type of verbiage all the time, but that's the technical name of the appropriations law. Today's webinar is a part of a series on these fiscal year 2012 home appropriations requirements. It's the 7th of 8 webinars, so there have been 6 of them already, including the very first one that was posted only on Home TA Info rather than being held live. And after today, there's going to be one more session. That session later this week is a companion to today's webinar, and it's targeted to CHDOs. So today, we'll be talking from a PJ perspective about how you need to assess CHDO capacity given these new requirements. And Thursday, we'll be talking to the CHDOs to help them understand, anticipate, and start to adjust to these new expectations, essentially covering the same material as today, but from the perspective of the CHDO being assessed rather than the PJ doing the assessing. All of the webinars will be posted to hometa.info following the live presentation. You'll be able to find copies of both the presentation, the handouts, and of course we'll get a recording and a transcript of the sessions up as well. So for those prior sessions, most of those recordings and transcripts are up as well as the presentations. As we noted coming in, we will take some breaks to address questions. That said, we expect there will be more questions than we can get to in a single 2-hour webinar, so we'll be working with HUD after this to develop written responses to frequently asked questions that come in during the session, through the evaluation, or through ongoing discussions that many of you are having with your local field offices. I would like to remind you that at any point during the presentation today, you can submit a question electronically through the live meeting client by clicking on the Q&A menu at the top of your screen. In the drop-down box, you'll be able to enter your question and push Ask. And again, if you'd like to ask your question verbally when we get there, you can go ahead and get into the queue by pushing star 1 on your phone. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and introduce some of the other folks that will be talking to you. Joining us from HUD headquarters, we're going to have Jenny Sardone. We expect to have Marcia Seigel, and we also have Letitia Jefferson, all from the Office of Affordable Housing Programs. And in a moment when Jenny talks, I think they'll let us know if we've got some other HUD folks as well. Again, my name is Steve Latham. I'm a project manager with Training and Development Associates, so you're going to be hearing from me quite a bit today. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Monty Frank of the Frank Consulting Group. Many of you have seen Monty on the training circuit over the years, and we're really happy to have him joining us in this effort today. In terms of our agenda, the overall goal, of course, is to help you implement the fiscal year 2012 Home Appropriations Law requirements. Our objectives for the PJs in the webinar include helping you to understand the context of the so-called CHDO Development Capacity Certification. And within all of this, we know that these come at a time when there are a lot of questions about the proposed rule, the current rule, new CPD notices that have come out this year, and just a lot of changes in the environment in which we're all working with the home program. So we want to demystify that and break those things into pieces for you. From there, we're going to talk about policies and procedures that PJs need to develop to implement the CHDO requirements imposed by the FY12 Home Appropriations Law, and how this interacts with the broader requirements about assessing developer capacity and fiscal soundness that come with those requirements as well as the existing rule. Of course, no training on federal programs will be complete without some time spent talking about documenting your analysis. And finally, we want to talk about some strategies that PJs can consider to help assist CHDOs in building their capacity as needed to meet these new requirements. Well, Congress and HUD are raising the bar to some degree on the evaluation of developer capacity, particularly as it relates to CHDO capacity. We still need to foster that local, community-based development capacity. So as PJs, not only do we want to make sure the groups we're funding have the capacity to undertake the CHDO set-aside projects, but we've got an interest in helping them build their capacity so we can get that set-aside funding out the door, and even more importantly, make sure that it gets spent on projects that actually succeed. Again, as we've noted, we'll take breaks at a few points during the presentation to address questions, and we'll use a good bit of time at the end of the webinar for those additional questions as well. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn the phone line over to Ginny Sardone at HUD to talk just a little bit about the legislative and regulatory context and where these requirements are coming from. Ginny?
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the CHDO Capacity Assessment webinar. I think that many of you have been on the numerous other webinars we've done on these appropriations requirements, so I'll try not to repeat too much about sort of what led to these requirements, these 4 specific requirements being in our appropriation, but everyone is probably aware of the fact that there were a couple of hearings last year, congressional hearings on the home program, and there were less publicly a number of meetings that took place between HUD staff and staff on the Hill. And one of the major concerns that Congress has with the home program right now is developer capacity. And that is not just CHDO capacity, but capacity of all developers, underwriting capacity of participating jurisdictions, and wanting to do more to ensure that when home funds are committed to a project, that the project moves forward timely, that it has all of the resources committed to it that are necessary, and that it's completed timely and meets its statutory, the statutory intent of the home program to provide affordable housing. So Congress has been specifically concerned about CHDO capacity and the use of, sort of the timeliness of projects undertaken by CHDOs, and they put into our 2012 appropriation requirements the requirement that in order, before a PJ commits home funds to a development activity to be undertaken with CHDO set-aside funds by a CHDO, that the PJ determine that there is demonstrated development capacity in the CHDO. And this is, to some folks and in some respects, perhaps a new requirement or something that seems much more stringent than what has been in the regulations before. However, I'll point out that there's always been a CHDO capacity requirement for designating an organization as a CHDO. So this is somewhat new and somewhat not new, and we certainly can talk about that as we move forward. I just wanted to sort of start out by pointing out that we have this 2012 appropriation language. It isn't exactly the same as the language that was in the home proposed rule. And the home proposed rule at this point in time is only a proposed rule. It isn't effective in any way until HUD completes the final rulemaking process and publishes something as a final rule. So today we're going to be focusing on the appropriations requirements only, and we will, we'll do everything that we can to try and avoid confusion, because there's been plenty of confusion on all of these requirements about what's in the proposed rule versus what's in the appropriation. So, with that, I'm going to turn it back to Steve so that he can dive into the content of the presentation today. Steve?
Okay, thank you very much, Ginny. I think that's a really helpful starting point for everybody on the call. And I guess I'd like to highlight a couple of things again that Ginny just said. This whole webinar series is focused on the 2012 Home Appropriations Law requirements. Today our topic is the CHDO Development Capacity Certification that comes out of that appropriation statute and the implementing guidance in CPD Notice 12007. And the proposed rule, despite some of the similarities and despite the fact that we know it's on a lot of your minds, does not exist for today's purposes. The training that we're doing today, the discussion that we're having today, is exclusively based on the existing rule and on the statutory requirements in the CPD notice. So for that reason, I think we want to start out by talking about the various perspectives on the issue of CHDO capacity, because when we go back and sort of step back and look carefully, what we're going to see is there are really several overlapping sets of requirements that writ large involve the issue of CHDO capacity, but from different perspectives. So we're going to kind of build a layer cake, as Monty and I were talking about earlier. We're going to start with a brief review of the existing home rule, the regulations that are in fact in place and have been in place for quite some time. And we'll see that the home rule as it stands today, along with CPD Notice 9711 that still governs the definition of a CHDO and the criteria by which a PJ designates an organization as a CHDO, actually preview some of the other themes we'll talk about. From there, we'll go on to talk about the so-called new requirements of the fiscal year 2012 CHDO Development Capacity Certification, including when it applies and when it doesn't. And then we also need to talk about the so-called project certification or project assessment certification that applies to all FY 2012 action plan projects. That requirement applies to all home-funded development projects, including those carried out by CHDOs. And as those of you who have listened to those prior webinars know, the issue of developer capacity and fiscal soundness is a big focus that actually goes beyond just our CHDOs. Finally, we'll want to talk a little bit about some broader perspectives or some best practices, many of which have been promoted by HUD in trainings and publications for quite a while, that again step back and try to take a more holistic or comprehensive view of CHDO capacity. So with that kind of roadmap of where we're headed, let's start with a brief review of the existing criteria for designation as a CHDO. All of these are driven by the current rule in the definitions section found at 92.2. That's where this thing that we call a CHDO is defined. Some of the more pro forma criteria include expectations about the organization's legal structure. To be a CHDO, you need to be organized under state law. You need an appropriate IRS designation as a nonprofit entity. You need to be an independent organization that isn't controlled by other entities, especially those that might seek to profit from your activities. Then we have some base criteria about your general purposes, right? An organization that wants to be a CHDO needs to exist at least in part to provide affordable housing. And to be a community housing development organization, you need to actually be serving a specific geographic area or a defined community. From there, several other criteria relate to the organization's governance. There are expectations about who's on the board. At least 1/3 of the board needs to be low-income individuals, residents of low-income neighborhoods, or representatives of low-income organizations. The other rule of thirds that we talk about is that no more than 1/3 of the board can be public employees or officials, and that same no more than 1/3 screen applies in the more limited set of cases where there's a for-profit entity that may get to appoint any of the board members, although again that's a pretty uncommon type of scenario in my experience. CHDOs also have to have a formalized process for getting input from the low-income residents they serve, and some basic accountability standard, financial accountability standards need to be in place. Finally, and where we're focused today, to be designated as a CHDO, the current rule already requires a PJ to review an organization's capacity and experience. An organization needs to demonstrate at least 1 year of experience serving its community, and it has to have, quote, demonstrated capacity to undertake home-funded projects. So let's dig into that specific requirement in greater detail. Looking right at the language in the current rule, to be designated as a CHDO, an organization must have, quote, demonstrated capacity for carrying out activities assisted with home funds. The rule then goes on to provide two paths by which that capacity can be demonstrated. Either the CHDO can hire experienced staff who have successfully completed similar projects, or it can hire a consultant with the same type of experience who can help complete the project and train the staff. So while some folks have expressed concern that the FY 2012 statutory language changed the requirements, I think it's helpful to start by looking closely at the actual text of the current rule to see that the foundation of the staff capacity requirement already existed. There are two elements here that at least preview some of the issues that come into sharper focus with CPD Notice 1207. First, the existing rule implicitly expects that CHDOs will have staff. And second, the rule requires experience with the type of project the CHDO is now planning to take on. The current rule does, of course, provide a bit of flexibility at this designation step. If the CHDO doesn't have staff with the needed experience, there's an opportunity to build that capacity through training from an experienced consultant. But even there, the implicit idea is that there are staff who will be trained, not that consultants will be around running the CHDO forever. So while we're about to talk about the FY 2012 Home Appropriations Law requirement for staff development capacity in a CHDO, we want to make sure that those folks who think this is something altogether new realize that it really isn't. It's just now being made much more explicit by the statutory language and by the new CPD notice. So let's look at the language from CPD Notice 12007, right from page 2 of the notice. PJs may only provide FY 2012 home funds to development activities to CHDOs that have demonstrated that they have staff with demonstrated development experience. From that starting point, we'll dig into the notice a little further. There are several issues we want to highlight today, starting with the applicability of this requirement, how that compares to the other FY 12 Home Appropriations Act requirements. From there, the notice provides a definition of CHDO staff that we'll unpack and expand upon. And then we'll come back to talking about the context within which the determination of capacity needs to be made by a local PJ. As you'll see, because HOME allows you to reserve funding for a CHDO prior to making a legally binding commitment, the standard that's required when you're dealing with other sorts of program participants like for-profit entities, you need to make the certification at the reservation stage. And for purposes of the FY 12 requirements, the capacity assessment should be explicitly made in the context of the project actually being funded. That emphasis on the size, scope, and complexity of the project is more rigorous in many ways than the more generic capacity determination that many PJs have actually been making for purposes of CHDO designation. One of the first things the notice expands on is the applicability of this requirement. This applies anytime you as a PJ reserve funds from the fiscal year 12 CHDO set-aside. That means you're reserving funds for a CHDO that will develop, own, or sponsor the anticipated project. There's no technical out here to say that, oh, the CHDO is just the sponsor, not the, quote, developer. And again, this applies to all CHDO reservations, even if the specific project has not yet been identified. So as we'll talk more about later, it can be hard sometimes to make such a determination if your local process has been to reserve funds for a CHDO in a generic, bring me a project that's eligible sort of way without a decent idea about the type, the scope, and the character of the project we're reserving funds for, even if we don't know the exact address yet. The prior webinars in this series have had a lot of questions on when these requirements apply and when they don't, so let's also cover some of the cases when this requirement doesn't technically apply. It doesn't apply to the award of CHDO operating funds per se. Remember, CHDO operating actually comes out of the entitlement portion of your PJ's grant and not the CHDO set-aside. It's not to say there's no interaction. To qualify for CHDO operating funds, a CHDO has to be receiving funds from the set-aside or expected to receive funds from the set-aside within 24 months. So there's a small window here, as Monty will talk a little bit about later, to help some CHDOs beef up their capacity with CHDO operating funds now, even if they're not fully ready to meet the enhanced requirement for funding from the set-aside at this point. This requirement and the certification that goes with it also don't apply when you're funding a CHDO for non-set-aside activities. Remember, the funny, almost axiomatic thing about a CHDO is that you're really only a CHDO when you're doing development activity from the set-aside. If you have a group that happens to also be a CHDO that's running your homeowner rehab program, for example, or running a standalone DPA program as your subrecipient, then this certification doesn't technically apply. Finally, the certification doesn't technically apply to reservations that some of you might still need to be making out of prior year's CHDO set-aside funds. This is different from how the project certification requirements covered in earlier webinars work. Those are applicable to any time an activity is identified as a 2012 Consolidated Plan or Annual Action Plan project. Today's specific requirement is actually a little more straightforward. It applies only to reservations that you code in IDIS as coming from FY 2012 home funds. In just a moment, we'll see a screenshot of that. Of course, that said, we think it's still a good idea, generally speaking, for you to apply some of the same basic perspectives on those projects. But this difference may give you some flexibility to work with CHDOs that have some capacity and a track record with you, but need additional time to adjust to the FY 12 requirements, And remember, as I think Jenny indicated earlier, so far Congress has indicated its intent to keep putting these same requirements into future appropriations unless and until the rule gets updated. However that update to the rule works out in the end. So we really can't hope that these new requirements turn out to be a one-time thing or a short-term thing until we get back to normal. This is likely the new normal for the home program. But again, back to that notion of when this applies, if you see the screenshot from IDIS, this certification applies anytime you're indicating a CHDO set-aside reservation coming from grant year 2012. And where this is all headed, ultimately, is what the certification looks like. So you'll see that on this next slide. PJs are going to see this certification each time you grant home funds from the CHDO set-aside. One thing to note here is that you will, or may have already seen this for any CHDO reservation you make moving forward, even if it's from a prior year. As a system, IDIS doesn't have the ability to show this only for fiscal year 12 projects. Once the certification is built into the system, it's sort of there across the board. This is true of the other FY 2012 certifications as well. But if you look carefully, and I know the screenshot is kind of small for some of you and may not be showing up all that well, the text of the certification makes clear where this is applicable. So to finish the reservation entry, you're going to have to electronically raise your right hand and say that for 2012 CHDO set-aside funds that will be committed to a CHDO project, these funds are being reserved for development activities that are to be carried out by a designated CHDO, and that the organization has demonstrated it has staff with demonstrated development experience. Finally, just like some of you heard us say in prior webinars, we recognize that the PJ staff person doing the IDIS entry isn't always the one with the specific knowledge of how the PJ did its review and made the funding decision. So when it comes time for monitoring, the key will be that your PJ files clearly have sign-offs from the people who have the authority to sign off on projects. There should be a clear paper trail showing that someone with that authority and with knowledge of the project and of the PJ's review of the project has signed off and indicated to the IDIS person that, yes, I'm accountable for the certification, it's accurate, and I'm acting on behalf of the PJ in this instance. The other thing to emphasize here is that this is a requirement that is in addition to, it's not in lieu of, the other existing rule requirements we talked about earlier in terms of designating a CHDO. And again, I want to remind everyone that the proposed rule is not in play today. There are similarities between the proposed rule and the FY12 requirements, but they're not the same thing, and we want to be careful to note a few times today that all of this discussion is based on rules that are in effect either through the existing rule or the statute and the implementing CPD notice. None of this is based on the proposed rule. Additionally, the projects that come out of these CHDO reservations are also going to have to meet the other fiscal year 2012 Home Appropriations Law requirements. Especially relevant for today's discussion is the requirement to assess the neighborhood market, evaluate developer capacity and fiscal soundness, and to underwrite the project, the so-called project assessment certification. So the additional CHDO development capacity determination is something you need to make on top of this. It's not a substitute for it. And it probably is obvious to everyone by now, but the deadlines coming out of the FY 2012 Home Appropriation Statute apply to all home activities, including CHDO activities. So as we begin to talk about staff, if a CHDO has to have staff with demonstrated development experience, we first want to be clear about what HUD means by staff. The notice actually provides a pretty straightforward and direct explanation. Quote, HUD defines CHDO staff as paid employees who are responsible for the day-to-day operations of the CHDO. They go on to say who specifically is not staff, and that includes volunteers, board members, or consultants. Now, one of the first things to clarify here is that paid staff can take on a few different forms. We're not always talking about an employee from an IRS standpoint of how that person is paid and who is paying the payroll taxes. We also can be talking about full-time or part-time staff. So for some of you who are working with smaller CHDOs where a part-time staff member is adequate given the level of production, maybe they're just doing 2 or 3 units a year, that's okay as long as you as the PJ determine the staffing level is adequate in light of the size, scope, and complexity of the project that you're funding. Also, HUD is not trying to get wrapped up in all the different forms that employment takes on in this day and age. So a CHDO who uses a contractual employee format where the staff person may be treated for IRS purposes as an independent contractor who receives a 1099 and pays their own payroll taxes, that's okay too. I suppose there may be other types of arrangements out there as well that some of you might see. For example, one of my neighbors works for the American Cancer Society. If you've ever done a Relay for Life walk, she probably designed the official t-shirt, water bottle, or whatever sort of memorabilia you left the event with. But while she was chosen, hired by, and works exclusively for the Cancer Society, for IRS purposes, she's an employee of Kelly Services. So my point is that there are a lot of different forms that employment now takes on, and HUD is accommodating that reality here. But while we've got flexibility to deal with the tax status of who is an employee and who isn't, it also leaves us with more work to do in defining an employee. Because as you'll see as we walk through this slide and the next one of the points where a lot of people have gotten confused or tripped up is in trying to contrast these non-traditional contracted staff who may not be employees from an IRS definition with consultants. There have been a fair number of questions since this notice came out about how do I distinguish between a so-called contracted employee and a consultant. So when we're talking about employees who are responsible for the day-to-day operations of the CHDO, key staff obviously have responsibility for the CHDO project, but they're likely to have organizational duties beyond just the project at hand. This is a potentially important way for PJs to distinguish between a project consultant and a contracted employee. Another critical distinction for employees is that they have not just project duties and tasks, but some level of authority to act on behalf of the organization. For example, approving contracts or change orders, approving income-eligible applicants for program participation, or those sorts of things. Finally, staff oversee and manage the development team. A consultant is a team member, and I think on that point, another related distinction is that staff tend to have more open-ended, ongoing contracts with the CHDO. Back to that notion of being responsible for the ongoing day-to-day operations. Well, consultants tend to have discrete scopes of work. Design this project, help me package this deal for financing, review the legal documents on this transaction, and then the contract is over. But that might be getting a little bit ahead of myself, so let me move to the next slide. Who doesn't count as staff for purposes of the 2012 certification of staff capacity? Again, the notice is very clear, stating that volunteers, board members, and consultants are not staff. Now, this doesn't mean that CHDOs can't or shouldn't supplement their staff capacity with expertise from volunteers or board members. We even encourage them to do that when we're providing CHDO training. Likewise, being self-aware enough to know that you need to hire additional technical expertise in the form of a consultant can actually be a sign of organizational capacity, showing that CHDO knows when to ask for help versus pushing ahead and getting into a project too deep. But again, this can't be the only source of development capacity. Congress, in the 2012 Appropriations statute, wants to see that the core development capacity is coming from the CHDO's actual staff. So let's go back for a quick second to that pesky distinction between CHDO staff and consultants. In some ways, it would actually be easier if we only had to look at the tax status of the relationship. Unless you get a W-2 from the CHDO, you're not staff. But I think HUD has properly allowed flexibility to deal with the range of employment relationships we see today. But that still leaves us trying again to articulate the differences between the two, or in this case, some of the characteristics of consultants. So with all of my apologies to Jeff Foxworthy, if your contract is activity or project specific, you're probably a consultant. If your contract is time limited, not ongoing, if it deals with discrete tasks and does not include general day-to-day operations of the CHDO, you might be a consultant. And if your authority is limited, if you provide your best advice to someone else, but they're responsible for making the actual decision, then you're probably a consultant. Finally, one other area that we need to discuss, because I know this has also been the topic of a lot of conversations, has to do with shared staff, where the CHDO shares its staff or is staffed by people who are employees of another parent organization. There are a lot of categories here. Sometimes we see a CHDO that's a subsidiary of a multi-service parent organization where the housing development activity is walled off for liability or other purposes from the larger parent. This might be a community action agency, a development spin-off from the Urban League or the United Way in some communities, or what have you. There are also a lot of examples of national nonprofits with local affiliates, where the local organization obtains some of its staffing from a larger regional or national entity. Volunteers of America and Habitat for Humanity are two examples that come to mind here. Perhaps the most sticky issue, just because of the attention that's been paid to it in the proposed rule, is around staff that are shared with a public entity like a public housing authority or even a local unit of government. But remember, for today's purposes, that proposed rule doesn't exist. And we don't know, and HUD can't actually legally say, because they're still in rulemaking, how this issue will finally be addressed following the public comments made earlier this year. So for today's purposes, in determining whether the CHDO has paid staff with demonstrated development experience, all of these are potentially acceptable scenarios. But again, this discussion assumes the CHDO is, in fact, properly designated as a CHDO within the existing rule. Regardless of the parent or subsidiary structure, the shared staffing relationship should be formalized. There should be a written interagency agreement, whether that takes on the form of an MOU, a professional services contract, an administrative services agreement, or whatever they decide to call it. That agreement typically should specify the staff who will serve as CHDO staff. Those specific staff should have appropriate experience and relevant skill sets, again in the context of the size, scope, and complexity of the projects the CHDO will take on. The agreement should outline specific services that will be provided and identify the responsibility and authority for day-to-day activities of the CHDO. Finally, the CHDO should actually pay for the staffing services that are flowing down from the parent. In practice, the CHDO is likely to be using its developer fees to pay for the folks who are its staff, even though at the end of the year the IRS will likely see those people as employees of the parent organization. So we've talked about the applicability and about who is staff and who isn't, basically whose individual capacity do we look at. But let's go back and look at the context of the certification that you as a PJ need to make to reserve and later to commit fiscal year 2012 funds. When a PJ looks at a CHDO for purposes of CHDO designation, we're looking at the existing rule and CPD notice 9711. And the rule does talk about capacity in a somewhat more generic way than the new requirement. As we touched on, there are suggestions about similar projects, but in practice, the designation determined that many PJs have been making has been something of a more generic determination of capacity to do some sort of home project. When you reserve funds from the 2012 set-aside, you will have to certify that the CHDO has staff and that that staff has generally relevant development experience. However, at the stage of reservation alone, you may not know the actual project type, so you can't always make that final determination of staff capacity. The fiscal year 2012 CHDO capacity certification at the project-specific commitment gets more detailed on this point. You're really focusing on developing projects, not just carrying out generic home activities, and it clearly points to projects of the same size, scope, and level of complexity. So in this context, it's entirely possible, for example, to determine that a given group, Acme Community Development Corporation, is a CHDO. It has some level of capacity, meets the other requirements about board composition, history of serving the community, what have you, but that the organization and its staff are not up for the project for which they've sought funding. Maybe the staff has done a great job doing a few home buyer units a year, but when you look at their experience compared to a 60-unit home rental project with tax credits and several other layers of financing involved, they're just not ready for that specific project. So to make the FY 2012 CHDO Development Capacity Certification, you need to have all these things come together at once. The initial CHDO designation under the current rule, the fact that CHDO actually has paid staff, and that those staff need to have experience taking on a project that is comparable enough to what they're proposing today to give you confidence they can do it. Then finally, when you do get to a commitment, we have to remember that the FY 2012 Project Assessment Certification, dealing with the project underwriting, the neighborhood market, and the developer's capacity and fiscal soundness come into play. That developer capacity and fiscal soundness, if you listen to the prior webinars, has to be seen in the context of the specific project as well. And the fiscal soundness angle in particular may add additional considerations to your review that go beyond just the staff know-how to the CHDO's financial resources to keep that staff in place and meet the needs of the project. So we'll stop here in just a second for questions, but there are a couple of other things we want to cover first. So far we're talking a lot about the technical requirements of the notice and the statutory changes. Monty will provide more practical advice about how to manage and adjust in a few moments, but it's worth taking a step back and seeing these new requirements and the certifications that you need to make as an opportunity to assess what we've been doing and how we've been relating to our CHDOs. In many cases, the FY 2012 Home Appropriations Law presents us with an opportunity to update and improve our local processes for both identifying and for funding CHDOs. As a 20-year-old program, the home program has developed both best practices and sometimes some less than ideal habits. One of the things Monty and I often see as we work with home participants across the country, including both PJs and CHDOs, is that sometimes the funding decisions are driven less by current performance and more by local tradition, inertia, or even those pesky local politics. And it's often those of you on the phone today, the PJ staff who are charged with administering home on that local level, that make these observations to us. We'll leave aside for a moment the whys, the wherefores, and the coulda, woulda, shouldas of how this has happened. But the point is that these requirements and the renewed emphasis generically on capacity and ultimately program performance give us all an opportunity to step back and making sure we're making the right decisions for the right reasons. What does that mean to you more specifically? What are some of the best practices you've seen and would at least suggest that you consider? Well, first and foremost, we need to be moving away from the concept of generic CHDO reservations that basically say, here's some money, go find a project, and moving towards project-specific commitments. Early in the home program, when we were still trying to figure out what a CHDO was, something the transcriptionists later today will probably have trouble trying to spell, let alone how to identify and work with them, it made sense to use reservations while we worked with a CHDO to put together a project, and the reservation concept gave PJs some flexibility to meet the program's commitment deadlines. But as Congress and the public, broadly speaking, pay more and more attention to capacity and ultimately to timely performance, our local programs need to make those shifts too. So we see a lot of PJs, especially state programs and larger PJs, running competitive processes, not just for the so-called entitlement portion of funding, but for CHDO seeking development funding as well. And those competitions are often based on, or at least provide a lot of points for, demonstrated capacity to perform on time and on budget. Similarly, even for those PJs that may not have highly structured competitions, we would suggest you incorporate project feasibility into your initial funding decisions. Waiting to make a reservation until the CHDO demonstrates not just the capacity required by the FY12 home appropriations requirements, but also making sure enough detail can be fleshed out about the proposed project to really assess if it's a project that's likely to succeed or just an idea that's not going to stand up to the scrutiny of due diligence. Finally, in some cases, it may be that you should be defining the project you want to see and seeking the developer rather than just offering funds to CHDOs that can bring you a project they've decided they want to do. In some ways, this may be less obviously connected to the specific CHDO capacity requirement, but it definitely helps when your market analysis shows a priority and an unmet need, but your CHDOs or other program participants are focused on protecting a program the way they've always done it, while you're concerned that that model just isn't working anymore. We'll talk more later about some strategies to work for working with your CHDOs to help them build their staff capacity. But as we move into the first break, we just wanted to get you thinking more broadly about some of the other downstream changes you might consider beyond just hitting the right technical checklist items. So with that, we'll take a break and take some questions. I'm going to turn the phone in just a moment over to HUD. But with that, what I'd like to do is go ahead and turn this over to Monty to start to dig deeper into the requirement for CHDO staff capacity.
Thanks, Steve. Hi again, everybody. Monty here. Looking through the names, I see a lot of familiar names, and some of you have been with us on the earlier webinars, and some of you have worked with on these issues for many, many years. When I heard a question come in on grandfathering, I thought that applied to the number of years I've been working on this CHDO issue, but I guess it was something else. The topic I've been asked to cover is the issue of how a PJ might analyze and document CHDO staff development experience and CHDO organizational capacity. The transition that I want to make here is Steve so far has been talking about the requirements, and the statute requires you to document and certify it, and the HUD notice similarly requires you to do it, but neither the statute nor the notice tells you exactly how to do it. That is left to you to determine what information you need from the CHDO and what kind of review you conduct and what your due diligence is to be able to certify. What I'll mention as I'm leading into this is that one of the download documents that Steve had mentioned is a sample checklist and also some notes or a key that goes with that checklist Some of you will probably recognize some of the issues and questions are similar to what we've covered in the CHDO Toolbox and CHDO Survivor Kit, but it's been updated to reflect the new 2012 requirements and to give you something to work with. These are sample documents, not required documents. It's just to give you an idea of what you might want to use to organize your review of capacity and experience. The CPD notice does require you to have written policies and procedures. It says on page 7 that the PJ is to develop and implement written policies and procedures for assessing CHDO capacity and ensure that the adequate documentation of this assessment is included in the appropriate files. So basically 2 things come from that. You've got to have a written standard approach to reviewing experience and capacity, and you have to be able to document it. As you know, in our federal world, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen, so that becomes an important part of our process here. Now I'm going to talk about the 2 requirements almost together, and you'll see if you're looking at the checklist that they are merged in that checklist. The staff development experience requirement of the 2012 Act, and also the requirement as part of the underwriting certification to assess developer capacity and fiscal soundness. Jenny just moments ago commented about there is a distinction between staff experience and organizational capacity, but they both are important for you to be able to move forward with the CHDO project. I'd just like to comment also, though, as a side note, is remember, it's not just about meeting some minimum statutory threshold. As the PJ, you are responsible for the CHDO funds, and in the event the CHDO expends the funds and fails to complete the project or meet the affordability requirements, you may have to repay those funds. So experience and capacity are critical to you protecting your home and CHDO investments, and it's not just a matter of meeting a minimum threshold, but rather you being confident that your CHDOs have what is needed to move forward and properly expend the funds. Now, in terms of the policies and procedures requirement, I've already read you the notice statement that says you should have policies and procedures. What you have as policies and procedures is left to you. You may already have some of these in underwriting policies. One of you that wrote in with the question on a NOFA process may have already had review criteria as part of that underwriting policy where you looked at developer capacity as part of your risk analysis or underwriting. Those may already be there. In addition, you may have already had a process that you followed in terms of CHDO designation, where you went through and reviewed their capacity and experience as part of the designation process, and maybe even used an enhanced designation process as we suggested in the CHDO Toolbox and Survivor Kit. So what might be in the policies that you'd need to put in writing? Well, certainly you'd want to define what you consider to be acceptable as staff for meeting that definition, paid staff, full-time or part-time, contracted staff, those other things that Steve talked about. Certainly there are a variety of staff arrangements that exist these days, and you want to define what you consider to be acceptable. You might want to look at the IRS 20 points for determining who are considered employees and developing your own policy. You'll also want to define what you consider to be relevant experience. It says demonstrate development experience. Ideally, you'd want staff to have comparable development projects successfully completed in the past, but as we know, that isn't always the case where they're doing exactly what they've done in the past, so it's sometimes a matter of sorting through past experiences to determine what is relevant to the proposed project. Have they supervised the development team before? Have they done budgeting and financing? Have they managed construction, conducted marketing, managed residential housing, conducted sales of properties? What are the directly relevant experiences that the staff have? So you might want to define beyond simply a statement of that they've done the same kind of project in the past. Our intent here is not to limit a CHDO and its growth. CHDOs need to grow into new projects, new activities, and things of that nature. But you still have to know that staff have experience and capabilities that directly respond to what they're about to undertake. You'll also want to define organizational capacity, both for the CHDO organization and its development team, and I'm going to hold off for a minute before I come back to those. In addition to policies, you will want procedures. What documentation are you going to require and when? When is it due? Is it due at the CHDO designation step, at the CHDO reservation step, project commitment step? When do you want the CHDO to submit that information? You obviously need to have this by the time you enter into IDIS, the reservation, and make the certification that Steve identified to you. In addition, you'll need to define the process for reviewing and approving or rejecting a CHDO's submission and the process that you'll follow for appeal. Let's talk a little bit further about what you might want in terms of staff development experience. As an anchor to this discussion, I want to go back to what development is in the CHDO set-aside. HUD's defined development for CHDO set-aside activities to include both homebuyer and rental housing, and it's defined it to include acquisition, construction, rehabilitation, and operation of rental housing, and acquisition, construction, rehabilitation, and sale of homebuyer housing. If it meets the CHDO definition, it's a development activity, and that's what we're looking for. Have they done development before? But as I mentioned before, it's not just a have they done it threshold. You're responsible for those funds, and you'll have to repay if they fail on their projects. So you'll want to look at whether they were successful and whether they have the specific skills needed to manage the development project that's currently conceived. That may run into issues of project and team management and financial structuring and lending and design and construction oversight and marketing and sales oversight and either managing properties or overseeing the management of the properties and other skills that are relevant. Again, we don't always have the convenient situation handed to us where the CHDO staff person has done exactly what it is they're proposing to do, but they may, through a combination of past development experiences, have the skills that you need to have confidence in them. I've listed some of these things just as a general checklist for you to mark down and to note the experience of staff. So you'll notice in the checklist that I provided that there could be more than one staff person working on the development, that they could have different roles or job titles. It's important for you to understand who it is you are reviewing for capacity and that they are going to be directly involved in the management of that project. In terms of documentation, there's a range of things that you can have. I noticed one of the questions came in asking about a board certification of employment. Usually what we're looking for from to document employee status is payroll, and sometimes we can go with the other federal employment documentation forms like W-4s or W-2s at the end of the year or things of that nature. Again, it is up to you, the PJ, to be satisfied that this person is employed by the CHDO, and you'll want documentation from that CHDO, but it can come in many different forms. As a policy, you should define what you will accept. Similarly, for contracted staff, we may have a formal contract or written agreement or a board acceptance of a person being contracted for a term. You could have a W-9 or a 1099 after the fact that's been issued for that person. Steve talked a bit about the contract or written agreement that you would like to see. We don't have a specific standard for written agreement, but he's suggested some of the details that might be in that contract or written agreement. Steve also has talked about the shared staff situation and the desire to have an interagency MOU or other kinds of written agreement if the parent shares staff with a CHDO subsidiary. Again, you'll need to figure out what you consider to be acceptable standards for and documentation for showing that the person is employed by the CHDO. In addition to the employment status, you'll want to document the relevant experience. I discussed in the previous slide that the optimal experience of having done a similar project before, whether it be home buyer or rental, is what we'd like to see, but it isn't always the case. However, for many times when a CHDO staff person has relevant experience, when the CHDO is growing into a new role, doing a new type of project, a different type of project than they've done before, we've talked on the previous webinars about the fact that some CHDOs have been doing home buyer activities and the home buyer market's saturated, and now they're looking at rental activities. These are all things that you want to look at in documenting experience. It might not be most directly related to an exact similar size, scope, and so forth for the staff person to have had experience with the type of project proposed, but it is something that you need to look for in all of their past experience. Remember that we can augment capacity in terms of organizational capacity with consultants and partners and others, as I'll talk about in a little bit, but that does not relieve you of this basic requirement to determine that staff have relevant development experience to manage the project. The second area then that we need to analyze is developer capacity and fiscal soundness. Obviously, the best indicator of capacity to do something in the future is past experience, and so that's something that we would rely on for an organization. It's something that would help you understand whether that CHDO knows the kind of development activity it's getting into. It's important for you to look at CHDO capacity separate from staff development experience. In my trainings with PJs and with CHDOs, I ask the question, who's the developer, the organization, or the person? Those of you who've been in those trainings know the answer is both. We need staff that have experience, but we also need an organization to provide the financial and management support to develop. You can't have one or the other. You absolutely need both. The 2012 appropriation language specifically targets staff experience, but the broader 2012 project requirement to underwrite includes the assessment of developer capacity and fiscal soundness, as Steve has mentioned. This requires you to look more broadly at that past experience, but in addition, what's their capacity currently, and even beyond the staff, to include board members and volunteers and development team members, consultants and partners, everybody supporting the development venture. Fiscal soundness is another part of the requirement for us in the underwriting certification. Fiscal soundness will address financial management practice, resources, and things that I'm about to discuss. And then there are other factors that I'll cover in just a few minutes on community, lender relations, reputation, and things of that nature. If you really want to do a complete analysis of the CHDO's likelihood of succeeding, it's a combination of staff experience and developer capacity that you need to do. In terms of development capacity and experience, you obviously like to look at past performance, as I mentioned. What the CHDO has done in the past, is it successfully completed its projects, what's the current project pipeline and broader responsibilities, how's the CHDO performing, can it add another project to its development responsibilities? But your inquiry can't stop there. Since with many CHDOs they've not done exactly the same, the type of or scale of project that's proposed, and even if they have done it in the past, you still need to look at their current capacity to do it. Capacity is a different word than experience, and so you need to look at what they're capable of. That includes looking at organizational structure, whether the organization is the appropriate kind for the development. Some of you will recall that in the toolbox and survivor kit we talk about the use of subsidiaries for a lot of development activities and creating legal firewalls to protect corporate assets from the development risk and things of that nature. It's important to look at that an organization is properly structured legally to do it. And also, it's important to look at whether the management structure is appropriate. Do they have the right oversight in place? Does the board have the right oversight structure? Do the staff have oversight in the activities that they're doing? What are the management practices for surveilling and overseeing a development project? You also want to look at the current pipeline and portfolio. Does the organization have the capacity to take on another project at this time, or are they mired in problems with existing development activities, or are they struggling with the viability of existing portfolio projects? It's not just a matter of what the CHDO is proposing to do, but what it has on its plate right now. You obviously want to look at staff capacity, and I've talked about some of that already, but board capacity is also important. I know that the CHDO designation checklist talks about board composition in terms of low-income representation and not being controlled by for-profit developers or managers or public entities, but the hole in the middle is the skills that board members need to be able to oversee a development project. Have they recruited a board that has those capacities to oversee development? And then there's a whole bunch of project-specific skills that may come up. If they're selling units, do they have the experience and capacity to properly market and sell those units? If they're doing rental projects, are they set up to operate rental units? There's a number of questions that this list brings up, and some of those are attached as in the key or the notes to the checklist that we provided as a download. Development team capacity. You can't do a full analysis of capacity to complete a project unless you also consider the capacity of the development team the CHDO has assembled. It's not just the CHDO and their staff that determine the capacity to develop. No one develops on their own. You've heard me say this in trainings, and no one person can develop a project by themselves. And in the same way it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a team to develop a project. And what kind of team have they assembled? For the project itself, the CHDO is likely to bring together a team of professionals and firms to play the various technical roles. In addition to contractor and architect, there's likely to be other professionals, including attorneys, accountants, marketing, management professionals, and other specialists. Has the CHDO assembled the right team with the right experience to fill all the roles, to fill all the gaps? Again, the team comes together at the time you're making a commitment to a specific project and may not all exist in place as you're doing a reservation, but you're looking for all the relevant skills that to make sure all the relevant roles, I should say, are filled at the time that they're ready to move forward with a full project commitment. In some cases, the CHDO may be utilizing a partner or a consultant to help it fulfill all its development oversight responsibilities. Of course, this has to be within the CHDO requirements, that it be the managing partner. The current rule permits both partners and consultants, but the CHDO has to have effective project control, and consultants are supposed to be directed to training CHDO staff. So you want to make certain that if they have these other partners or consultants in, that they're playing the appropriate role, and the CHDO still has its role with effective project control. You'd also want to look at whether the team has relevant experience and whether they've worked together before. If they've worked together before, you have more of an indication of their ability to work together in the future. I'd like to also talk for a couple of minutes about fiscal soundness, which is the other phrase that comes from the statute and the notice when you're assessing a CHDO developer. I want to start with going back to the CHDO designation. One of the requirements is that the CHDO have financial management systems in place that meet the standards of Part 84, Section 21. The 7 standards are listed there, something that I take very seriously and is actually something we spend a lot of time on in courses on CHDO management. The standards at 8421 require them to be able to provide accurate, current, and complete disclosure of the financial results of each federal program or project. It requires them to maintain records that identify adequately the source and application of funds for federal activities. It requires them to safeguard all assets and assure they're used solely for authorized purposes. It requires them to produce regular comparison of outlays with budget amounts for each award and, where possible, relate the outlays to performance and cost data. It requires them to have written procedures for minimizing the time between the receipt of federal funds and the issuance of payment. It requires them to have written procedures for determining the reasonableness, allocability, and allowability of costs, what we call the OMB cost principles. And it requires them to maintain cost accounting records that are supported by source documentation. Isn't it a federal rule when the last word is documentation? Why do I talk about these? Because these have been existing all along. Most of us PJs have accepted certifications from a CPA or a board or a chief financial officer that a CHDO meets these, but these are really key. If they have good financial management systems in place, this is one of the cornerstones of fiscal soundness. They can't possibly know what's happening in their organization if they don't have these financial management procedures in place. A second cornerstone of fiscal soundness is financial stability. The question is there stable and adequate funding for operations? I noticed one of the questions already came in asking about, that Marcia's answered, about whether it's payment of staff or other costs. And part of my response there was, if the CHDO can't survive, we can't have a successful project. We need the CHDO to survive. We need to make sure that they are able to cover all of their other costs in addition to project costs. And the project costs themselves raises the liquidity question. Are there funds within the CHDO or the team to pay the project bills? Some CHDOs would say, well, we're going to be funded from all these different federal sources. And my answer is eventually yes. But in the meantime, there are pre-development costs that may come up and have to be paid well before a closing occurs and funds become available. I understand that you have the opportunity to do CHDO pre-development loans. We'll talk about those in the last section. There's also capital advances and outlays that occur throughout the project prior to reimbursement. And there's also the fact that developer fees tend to come in later in a project, not up front, so a CHDO's outlaying money to cover its staff and internal costs of project development until it reaches those milestones where it earns fees. All of this requires the CHDO to have liquid funds to be able to pay bills. Without money, the project does not move forward. When you have deadlines to complete and sell these projects now, you really need to know that they have the money to move the project forward in a timely manner. In addition, there's the audit issue. There's the question of whether audits are done in a timely manner, whether there are findings, and whether those findings have been successfully resolved. Audits are not just a requirement when a CHDO or other entity goes over certain thresholds to trigger A133. Audit is important to any nonprofit business out there. And finally, the portfolio question. I've already raised that in the earlier discussion of capacity. What they've got in the pipeline, what they have in their current portfolio. I've seen many CHDO organizations struggle not because of the current project, but because of their past and how it's dragging them down. Projects not properly funded, where they're constantly having to put additional funding into the project to keep it viable. It's not just the proposed project that could put a CHDO at risk. It's all its past projects in its portfolio. Again, there are questions, additional questions above and beyond this that are provided in the checklist and the key or notes that are attached to it in a separate file. Then there's just some other factors that come into play that are really important to development. Most of them run to how a CHDO manages its various relations that are critical to the deal. First, I'd like to mention CHDO community relations. Obviously, a lot of CHDOs do this naturally and do it well. They're community-based by definition. The low-income community is their primary customer and their focus in their CHDO activities. The CHDO has to have low-income representation on its board, and it also has to have a formal process for input from the low-income community. These are basic requirements, but they're also critical development skills. The ability to get along with the abutters and the neighbors and to deal with NIMBY factors and all those other things are key factors in the success of development. And an organization that handles these things well enhances their chances of successfully completing a development. One other aspect of the community relations is the relationship with the local government. Whether or not it's with you, the PJ, or more broadly with the local government that has to approve a project and provide inspections and support, it's important that the CHDO get along with that local government. Then there's also lender relations. It is absolutely important or critical to a CHDO that it have good working relationships with all its lenders and funders. This and all the other things are core skills that developers need, and you want to look at those. In addition, as I mentioned before, there's project-specific skills, some of which are listed there that run to whether it's a for-sale project or a rental project. All of this leads to the certification that Steve read to you earlier in the presentation. I think the thing that I want to stress right here is you are making this certification. How you make this certification is up to you. It's up to the policies and procedures that you establish, the due diligence that you do in that analysis, and the documentation that you prepare and put in the file when you make this certification. It's real easy to check that I agree box, but have you done enough to be able to say that we really have looked at capacity and looked at staff experience? So please go back through the slides and the samples that we've provided you here and start to come up with policies, procedures, and your process for doing the analysis and documentation. And I hope some of these things have helped you. I want to cover one more topic before I give it back to Steve and HUD for more questions. By now you should have a pretty good idea of what the Congress is requiring and what HUD expects of you with regard to CHDO staff experience and CHDO capacity. But a lot of you are probably thinking, well, I have a lot of CHDOs that just might not meet that threshold as we stand here today. It's been an ongoing challenge for us in this industry to try to help and build CHDOs. And all of a sudden it seems like we're raising the bar or establishing a higher first step that some of your CHDOs might not meet. You may have some CHDOs that don't have staff, or that share it with a parent organization, or have staff that don't have any direct development experience, or perhaps experience that's not all that directly relevant. And you're worried about how you're going to get those CHDOs to this next step where you can make this certification. I want to talk just about a couple of things. Obviously, the CHDO toolbox and the CHDO survivor kit that have been out there and available to you since 2003, 2004, have covered a lot of these topics where it talks about making an organization successful. Some of you may recall that in the trainings and in those guides I've said that you can only accomplish mission if you're successful as a business. A lot of nonprofits don't have the business skills. They have the mission clear in their minds, and they have the commitment to that mission, but not necessarily the business skills. It's important that we support CHDOs that have a sense of what it takes to be successful as a business, and in particular successful as a development business, which is probably one of the toughest things in the not-for-profit industry. What are some of the things that you can do? First, under business planning, you want to encourage them to do strategic planning. It's not just an academic exercise. It's actually setting the course, giving themselves some direction as to where they want to take the organization, getting clarity about purpose, but also developing strategies for funding and making those initiatives happen. I've got a rather practical approach to strategic investments that isn't the traditional strategic planning model, but there's a lot of different approaches out there, and local universities, foundations, and others support this kind of venture. Please try to get your CHDOs to do strategic planning to focus on their development role so that they can be successful. I also previously mentioned board composition as being key to success, and I wasn't talking about the CHDO designation requirements. I was talking about board members that have development skills and business skills. Take a look at their board composition and maybe help them recruit board members that have those skills while still reserving enough spaces for low-income representatives. Identify training opportunities for the staff. Look at what courses are being offered at hometa.info, and even talk with your field office about what courses might be offered locally if there are none scheduled locally now. I know it's hard for CHDOs to travel. Most of them don't have travel budgets to go long distance, but it is important that you try to bring training to them. They cannot improve without some training and assistance. Look at the operating budgets as well as their audits. Are there things you can identify for them to work on to improve their financial management and their financial condition? If they're lacking in certain skills, they have basic experience and basic development skills, but they're taking on a venture that's a little bit beyond what they've done in the past, maybe match them up with partners or consultants. I've already cautioned you that you still have to make sure that the CHDO retains effective project control, but there are many situations where they can work with partners or consultants and still meet that requirement. And we've included a bit of advice on how to select and negotiate with partners in the CHDO Survivor Kit. And remember that there's still some CHDO intermediary TA and funding that's available through HUD. And again, talk to your field office about getting access to any of those funds that might remain available. HUD has committed a lot of money to the CHDO intermediaries to build capacity in the CHDO community, and I hope you have taken advantage of that and continue to take advantage of it. I'd obviously also want to talk about those optional benefits that the home program provides. What I've talked about so far is the requirement that CHDOs have the capacity to expend the project funds, but we haven't yet talked really about those other things that the home statute and rule provide to help you build capacity in CHDOs. Specifically, CHDO operating expenses, CHDO pre-development loans, and CHDO proceeds. These are things, again, that we've discussed as to how you can use them. They're not a requirement, but they are options you can use. They're both in the toolbox and Survivor Kit. Under operating expenses, you're permitted to provide up to 5% of your annual home allocation to CHDOs for general operating expenses. These are not project dollars and cannot be used directly for projects, but they can be used to build the operating capacity of the CHDO to do development, to hire staff, train staff, pay operating expenses while they focus on preparing for development. Remember, this can only be used for CHDOs that have active CHDO projects or expected to be funded by you in the next 24 months. Second, under pre-development loans, you have the ability to do pre-development loans up to 10% of the amount of funds that you've put that year toward the CHDO set-aside. And those can help pay those upfront pre-development expenses that I mentioned are part of the liquidity challenge that most CHDOs in this country face. And make no mistake about it, liquidity is one of the things that slows CHDOs down and makes it difficult for them to perform in a timely manner. If you have not been using this particular facility in the home program, please take another look at it and take advantage of it. Obviously, we have a special benefit here in the ability to forgive those loans in the event the project doesn't go forward through no fault of the CHDO. So these are dollars that you can put up front and help the CHDO determine feasibility and do those other upfront things that will help move the project along. But if for some external reason it cannot move forward, you do have the ability to forgive. It's an important benefit that too many of you overlook. Third, CHDO proceeds are really a long-run benefit, not a short-term thing to build capacity. You can help a CHDO in the long run to build its financial stability by allowing it to keep what would otherwise have to be returned to you as program income. In the program, we call it CHDO proceeds, and its uses are limited to home and other low-income housing activities, but nonetheless, it's a source of funds to support their ongoing efforts at building a pipeline, and pipeline is key to being successful as a developer. So take a look again at these three options that you have in the program to see whether you're taking maximum advantage of them. You also have the ability to help the CHDO succeed through your underwriting and packaging. Underwriters are called risk assessors for the reason that they actually are looking at risks of success and that they have opportunities to affect a project and mitigate those risks. You've heard quite a bit about underwriting in 2 prior webinars, so I'm not going to go into it there, but make sure that project that they're thinking about has an identified market. They're not addressing need, that they're addressing demand, and that they've adjusted their product to respond to the market. Make sure they've right-sized the project for their capacity. Too many CHDOs take on projects that are too big for their capacity and resources, and then we wonder why they don't succeed. Make sure you've right-sized the assistance that you're providing them. In so many projects that we've looked at that have had to be worked out, the project was underfunded, and the home funds were not provided at a level that made it sufficient to complete the project or to sustain the project. And make sure that you can only help them up front, so make sure you help them with enough funding so that the financial and physical sustainability of the project can be assured. I've already mentioned then review for sustainability. From a design standpoint, that means looking at physical improvements that you can do to keep operating costs down. Energy improvements, longer useful lives on building system and structural components, and things of that nature. Also, contributions to reserves and other upfront capital expenditures can help ensure sustainability. Now, you know there's a limit on what home can fund in terms of reserves, but most projects are funded out of multiple sources, and just because home can't pay for it does not mean that project should not have those things built in from other sources. Also, make sure you're paying reasonable developer fees. I say it all the time, development fees are the lifeblood of the development industry. If you don't pay them full fees, they can't survive, period. Don't expect them to do it for less. You're just squeezing out their future financial viability as an organization when you squeeze their developer fees. At the same time, you know I've talked to you about making certain that the fees are structured to be earned at milestones of accomplishment. You don't get paid for showing up, you get paid for getting work done. And finally, make sure that you're making progress payments against those fees. Don't make CHDOs wait to the very end to receive all of their fees, but you could do progress payments along the way as they accomplish milestones. Most CHDOs can't survive to the end of a project to be reimbursed for their internal costs through developer fees. Finally, I'd just like to talk a moment about supporting the CHDO. Funding them is just the start of the relationship. You need to stay by their side through the completion of the project, and that means that you will get involved throughout the development phase. You might participate in kickoff meetings and progress meetings, have ways of tracking their progress and questioning them regularly on lack of progress, doing inspections, providing assistance with negotiations, looking at it, reviewing and analyzing change orders, and a whole host of other construction period tracking and support activities. You need to keep an eye on the project as it's being implemented, not just think of it as something that you show up as a lender to disperse at the time that there's a requisition. I also want you to think more broadly about your monitoring and TA strategy, how you watch the CHDO and not just its project. We do have in the current rule the requirement that you monitor the project while it's being implemented and on an ongoing basis, but it really runs to the compliance questions. Most of you are aware that we're moving more toward an understanding that you have to monitor an organization and you have to monitor its financial health. It's not just about regulatory compliance, it's about the health of the project and the organization. So figure out how you're going to track the CHDO. following board minutes, checking in with the CHDO ED or board during the project, check on whether or not it's having a financial impact on the organization by requiring CHDO financial reports, all kinds of things that you can build in to your monitoring while they're implementing. They may be getting the project done, but in the process putting themselves out of business. We realize that you can't solve every CHDO issue with the limited resources of the home program, but ultimately your success depends in part on your CHDO's success. If they fail, you may be handed a failed project and a possible repayment burden. We need our CHDOs to succeed. We need to give them every bit of assistance we can muster so that they and the program can succeed. Uncompleted and unsuccessful projects will lead us to more appropriations hearings and cuts and requirements such as those we've been explaining to you. Let's do what we can to show Congress and the American people that we can make this part of the program succeed. And remember Steve's earlier slides as he handed things off to me. Sometimes these challenges mask an opportunity for you to address non-performance issues that have been bothering you for years. Seize the opportunity to tighten up on your CHDO part of the program and focus on those organizations that can give you success. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Steve for a couple of things and allow him to do a wrap-up and then transition into questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Monty. Before we go back to the Q&A here at the end, I'd like to touch on a couple of summary items and some housekeeping reminders for everybody. Hopefully we've provided you with a better understanding of how the FY 2012 CHDO development capacity requirement relates to both the existing home rule and how the new requirement builds on the existing CHDO designation expectations to have you as a PJ look specifically at the staff and at the size, scope, and complexity of the CHDO project being taken on at the time you're making a reservation, and how this echoes the same concerns that Congress had in requiring what we're calling the project assessment certification that, among other things, requires you to look at any developer's capacity, including their financial strength, when you make a formal home commitment. Monty has shared with us more practical tips about how to document these things, some of the specific types of items to look at, and how to be holistic in our approach. And we step back to talk more about best practices that can help our CHDO succeed, and as Monty rightly points out, in so doing, help your local program succeed as well. So we hope you've now got a better understanding of both the technical requirements and a broader perspective on how to start making it work in your community. We know these types of changes aren't easy, but hopefully together with the support from HUD through technical assistance, through trainings, working together with some of your other PJs, and working together with your CHDOs, we know we can get through this as a program. Before we do the Q&A, again, I would like to remind everybody about the available resources. These are already available on the hometa.info website, and you can also download those from within the live meeting client. Again, to do that, you go to the upper right portion of your screen. You click on the button that looks like 3 sheets of notebook paper that will open a dialog window and allow you to download those files. In addition to the slideshow from today, you have the opportunity to download a sample CHDO staff capacity and organizational capacity checklist for program year 2012 funding. That includes actually 2 files. There's an Excel file that is the checklist itself, and there's a PDF file that sort of provides some notes or some explanation of kind of the questions behind the questions. And then, of course, we've provided you with a copy of the CHDO Toolbox for home PJs that you can download. And again, if you've not already seen it at this point, make sure that you download the actual operating guidance, the CPD Notice 12-7, which is linked here. You can copy and paste that into your browser. Additionally, a couple of other reminders, the presentation, the recording of today's presentation, and the supplemental materials will be available on the website, and later we will be posting the recording, the transcript, and the frequently asked questions. We know there are more questions coming in than we'll get to. Some of your questions are detailed enough that we're going to have to respond to them in writing. At the very end, after we get out of the Q&A, we will put you into a window that allows you to complete an evaluation sort of through SurveyMonkey of today's webinar, and we appreciate your feedback on that. As you think through, if you've got additional questions, you can also enter them in that evaluation, and we'll make sure those get to HUD. Finally, if you have highly specific questions that are very detailed to an individual project or just raise a really sticky issue, we would suggest that you discuss those with your field office. Okay, well that's, I guess, a good sign to us. What we're going to do is remind you there is another webinar on Thursday for the CHDOs, and thank you everybody for your participation. Thank you to the HUD staff for your time, and to everybody for your contribution to the learning by asking the questions and providing your input. We're going to turn on the evaluation survey for you, and with that, again, please watch the website. There will continue to be resources posted for you. Encourage your CHDOs to sit in on the webinar later this week, and with that, I think we're done with the presentation today. So we'll ask Brenda to put the presenters back into conference, and everybody else can hang up and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. And this does conclude today's conference call. Thank you for your participation, and you may now disconnect. Presenters, please stand by.